Your Eminence, Cardinal DiNardo, Excellency, Bishop DeLauro, my brother priests and deacons, religious men and women, knights and ladies of Peter Claver, brothers and sisters in the Lord. I want to begin today with a metaphor. Like many of you, I carry a cell phone. Mine is a slick little machine that fits neatly in my pocket. Does all sorts of neat little functions, like containing my schedule, my address book, thousands of numbers of parishioners past and present. Has a nice camera. I can take really nice pictures. Gets my emails, deposits my checks, does a whole lot of things. It comes real handy on the golf course. I can get yardage, I can get a bird's eye view of the fairway, etc. And yes, it does one other thing. It makes and receives phone calls. Now, when a call comes into this phone, I have some options. If the call is from someone in my address book, the phone will show me the person's name, maybe even the person's picture. So I can decide if I want to speak to that person or not. Now, if the person making the call is not in my address book, usually a number will appear. Then I wonder if it is really from someone I want to speak to. It could be a long-lost friend. It could be from someone who's changed their phone number. Or maybe it's just an annoying telemarketer. Anyway, with my cell phone, I can decide whether I want to speak to someone or send them to voicemail. Now, all of us, to varying degrees, receive calls from the Lord. Now, He probably won't call you on your cell phone, okay? So you can go ahead and switch that off if you have it. But we all do receive calls from the Lord. The question is, do we recognize His number? Sometimes, like the two disciples in the gospel today, we recognize the Lord and follow. Sometimes we don't recognize His call and can't be bothered with answering. Often, though, we just send the Lord's call to voicemail. You know, we might be afraid of what He's going to ask of us. He might demand something more than we are willing to give. Maybe we'd rather deal with Him later. Maybe if we ignore it long enough, He'll just leave us alone. Then we don't have to do anything at all about it. Maybe He'll just move on to other people. We forget, as we read in Romans chapter 11, verse 29, that the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. And that is the sad truth of our reaction to God's call. If we don't respond like Samuel in today's first reading, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening," or in the words of the psalm response, "Here am I, Lord, I come to do your will," we might miss our opportunity to do God's will. Now, I think it is both serendipitous and providential that we are gathered this weekend to honor the memory of Martin Luther King Jr., a man who had an obvious calling from God, and the readings invite us to meditate on the concept of vocations. Now, I won't bore you with all the etymology of the word, I think it suffices for we all know that vocation is a calling, a mission from God, an avenue that the Lord has designated for a person to serve him, usually by serving others, and often at great personal cost to the individual. But finding one's vocation, one's mission in life can be difficult. Finding one's mission in life can, be something of a mystery at times. If only it is easy to know exactly what God wants. See, it's not without reason that St. Paul writes in Romans 11, verse 34, "For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor?" In today's readings, my dear friends, we hear about the call of Samuel and of the Apostle Andrew and his unnamed companion. In the first case, there was an elderly and experienced priest, Eli, who helped the young lad, Samuel, discern the voice of the Lord. In the second case, the two disciples had John the Baptist, who pointed out the Lord to them. But many times, one does not have the benefit of having clarity about what the Lord desires of us. The proper response, then, is to make sure to be always disposed to do the will of God, whatever it is. To make sure to rise to the occasion whenever we feel He is calling us to a good cause. Such was the case of Dr. Martin Luther King, in memory of whom we gather today. He grew up a simple son of a Baptist preacher who felt that his vocation was to follow in the footsteps of his father and grandfather and becoming a minister and a family man. But as it turned out, God was calling him to something greater. He was calling him to be a voice for the voiceless, to be a herald of justice in an unjust society, to be an architect of peace in times of turmoil, to be an apostle of nonviolence in an arena in which violence was all too common. There was nothing dramatic or spectacular about the moment of his calling. Now, my impression is that he did not hear an insistent voice calling out to him in the middle of the night like Samuel did. He didn't have the benefit and clarity of a John the Baptist who pointed out to him that which was obscure. He didn't have a Damascus Road experience where he was suddenly knocked to the ground like St. Paul and realized that he ought to be headed in a different direction. There was none of that. It seems to me that he simply rose to the occasion when much was expected of him. And at that moment, the grace of God sparked within him. That moment, I think, came for Dr. King on December 5, 1955. That evening at his church in Montgomery, the Holt Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, he would be unexpectedly put in charge of the civil rights movement. He was called upon on very short notice to speak to the thousands that had gathered to confirm the now famous Montgomery bus boycott, arising from the daring resistance of Mrs. Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on a city bus for a white person and was arrested for this perceived effrontery. In that hastily prepared speech, Dr. King first spoke about the fine Christian character of Mrs. Parks, noting that it was good, since the arrest had to happen, that it happened to a person who nobody could call a disturbing factor in the community. He then went on to speak these now famous words. He said, "You know, my friends, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. There comes a time, my friends, when people get tired of being plunged across the abyss of humiliation where they experience the bleakness of nagging despair. There comes a time when people get tired of being pushed out of the glittering sunlight of life's July and left standing amid the piercing chill of an alpine November. There comes a time." Well, that time came for Dr. King on December 5, 1955. He rose to the occasion. He found his voice, and all was never the same again. For the next 12 years, he not only became the voice of civil rights, but also its personification. He would put his life on the line again and again, content with getting into what he and his friends called good trouble, which is non-violent civil disobedience. Despite criticisms, despite attacks that were both verbal and physical, he did not back down even till that fateful day, April 4th, 1968, when he was gunned down by an assailant at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, I submit to you that Dr. King found his true vocation within his vocation to family life and marriage, within his vocation to ministry, within his vocation to learning and scholarship. Though not perfect, Dr. King's life is an example of the unique paths the Lord takes each of us on. Only 26 years of age at the time, imagine that. Only 26 years old, he was transformed from a simple preacher to the greatest leader of a movement, the purpose of which was to conscientize a nation on the true meaning of its creed. We believe these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And totally guided by the gospel of Christ, he preached a message of inclusion. He preached a message of reconciliation. He preached a message of adopting outsiders into a family, a message of a hope for a future full of possibilities. Now, Dr. King stands as a modern-day example of how the Lord uses ordinary, simple ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary tasks. Like most of us, King was imperfect and weak, but he was able to rise to the occasion and discover his true calling because he was first and foremost disposed to the will of God. As he famously said in a 1956 sermon, the end of life is not to be happy. The end of life is not to achieve pleasure and avoid pain. The end of life is to do the will of God, come what may. To do the will of God, come what may. That is, brothers and sisters, our common vocation. To do the will of God, come what may. That's why Dr. King gave his life so that all marginalized peoples, not just black people, may have a fair shake of the American dream. To do the will of God, come what may. That's why several people, white and black, marched and died in the civil rights movement to awaken the consciousness of a nation that was in slumber. To do the will of God, come what may. That's why you and I must continue to keep alive their dream, the hope of a truly free and just nation, by working for peace and reconciliation and the common brotherhood of all people. My brothers and sisters, we probably are like Dr. King in many ways, preparing with one vision of life in mind, only to find out one day that our true calling lies in a different direction. And at a given moment, suddenly God enables us to rise to the occasion and speak the truth that changes everything. But one thing is certain: we do not find purpose in the preservation of self, but in rising to the occasion whenever we are called upon to serve. So whether it be about fighting for justice and peace in your family, in your neighborhood, or wherever it exists, or wherever you're called, rise to the occasion. Whether it be about standing up for those who are alienated, isolated, or discriminated against because of the color of their skin, because of a disability, or because of a social status, rise to the occasion. Whether it be about fulfilling the civic duty of voting to elect leaders who are God-fearing and determined to further the cause of justice and fairness in our land, rise to the occasion. And above all, whether it be a matter of praying for peace and the healing of racial and ethnic divisions here in America and around the world, rise to the occasion. Rise to the occasion, my brothers and sisters. It is by rising to the occasion to do the good that must be done that we dispose ourselves to accomplish the will of God. And the Lord, who has begun the good work in us, will bring it to completion. Amen.